Joining me now is Amina Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Madam DSG, it's so great to see you. Thank you so much for being with us here today. Let me start by asking you this. The pandemic has really highlighted the fact that the Sustainable Development Agenda needs to be adopted even faster. How can we ramp this up now?
Well, absolutely right. Great to be with you. I think first and foremost, let's look for the silver lining in the COVID response. It's really important that what is happening in countries as we look at the socioeconomic impact, that as we look to stimulus packages and fiscal space that's being filled, that we almost take the opportunity to leapfrog. So on connectivity, as kids go out of school, how can we make sure that we improve that infrastructure for everyone? If we are speaking about the transformations and the transitions we need to make for climate action, how can we make sure that we put in the energy transition so that off-grid and renewable goes to women and young people and creates jobs at the local level? So it's really to look at what is it that we've gone off track with and what can we actually not just put on track, but scale up? Because the offer of those investments is forthcoming, not at the levels that we want to see. But clearly, it's moving in the right direction, and that's what we really want to reinforce: is how can we make sure green transitions become one that we do now and not wait? That the response to COVID, in terms of the financial resources, but also the capacities and the vaccine, are in place so that we can open up our economies and get back to work on the SDGs.
What does a green recovery look like to you in practical terms?
Well, in very practical terms, first, let's make sure it's moving towards a 1.5-degree world. It's really important that that transition happens. Second, that we see the financing flows come to us where there is 50-50 spent on both adaptation and mitigation. And so when we come to countries that are investing, let's invest in the energy transitions, going to renewables, whether they are solar, they're hydrogen. You need to make sure that that happens at the local level and at the level at which is creating jobs. The connectivity that we talk about, the digital divide, closing that in a transition that sees infrastructure greener. And then to look at the food systems again. We are going to want to and need to transform the world, the way we consume, the way we produce. And so the food systems, that ecosystem itself, the full value chain, the full cycle to that needs also to change, and we need to take profit of that. So that green transition needs to be resilient, needs to focus on 1.5 degrees, and it needs to make sure it's inclusive. And that people, especially young people and women, are at the center of the results that we see in that transition.
Let's focus on the impact of the pandemic, in particular on women and girls. DSG, it's been so profound and such a huge setback. Where does the recovery there even begin?
Well, I think it begins where you can identify and see the impact. I mean, the impact has been on women and girls. I think they felt that most, whether it is in the informal sector, where suddenly you're taken out of an income, a workplace, where you are perhaps even supporting the family and the community, and to find ways to bring one back into the economy. And in the meantime, there must be some bridging. So social protection programs are really important to women and to young people in the job and the informal economy. The second tragedy that we have is that we've seen gender-based violence really scale up. I mean, in a way that we can say that that's the silent pandemic. In the lockdown, we find many women locked away with their perpetrators and nowhere to go. But as we are coming out of this, there needs to be a full-scale addressing of this as we would a pandemic, with champions in our leaders, in our countries, to acknowledge that we have to bring gender-based violence to zero. We've seen more marriages, early marriages that shouldn't be happening. We've seen more girls who've fallen out of school, may not go back to school again. So the risk for remaining off track and the impact that this has had on women and girls is huge. There are many, I think, instances now where we are getting more clarity country by country, where these issues are and how to prioritize women and girls back into the investments that we make in the economy. I think perhaps the third thing that I would speak to is women's leadership. It's been seen around the world that it is women in their leadership that have been able to look across the full spectrum of the dilemmas that we face and the challenges. And so to see women in leadership roles where decision making is being made about resources and how they are shared, it will become much more equitable. You put a woman in charge, doesn't leave anyone behind. It's important to see that in the elections that continue to happen, that we continue to have the opportunity of that space opened to a 50-50 parliament. I think the affirmative action over 30% is important, but we need to see much more than that so that we can begin to take decisions again over laws, over legislation, and over appropriations that are made for that. So I think, you know, again, the women's agenda is a rights agenda, and women are 50% of our human family, and they need to be included. And this has never been so stark in our absence that, you know, one needs to take profit of that. As I said right at the beginning, there is a silver lining. It is possible, and we can begin to recover in a much more equitable way with women and young people at the center.
Speaking of equitable, let's look at the SDGs themselves. DSG, you played a key role in drawing up the 17 SDGs. How do you assess where we are now with them today?
I'm still very hopeful that an integrated agenda like this is an integral part of what each country does in order to give their people fundamental rights. We are off track on the SDGs and further off than we were when before COVID came. So, but I am hopeful that what we can do is that we can begin to accelerate. It's become plain and clear where these, where we've seen COVID look at the exacerbation around inequalities and how we can bring those back front and center. So SDGs are off track, but there's a lot to do that we can put them back on again. There's a decade of action. There are the unfinished MDGs, which are the first 6 goals, from ending poverty all the way to sanitation. But the middle piece, from 7 to 15, are where major investments are needed. And this is where we need the global community to stand up and have that response in which we can invest in countries. This is not charity. This is in everyone's vested interest to see a more peaceful and stable world, where economies are not so stable, where there is exclusion. Then we will continue to see the instability, the insurgencies, and women, of course, bearing the brunt, and young people without hope. This is a time when there should be an intergenerational transition, that we profit from COVID to see a much more equal world. Finally, I think with the SDGs, where we are working really well, is seeing that there is a focus on building stronger institutions and partnerships that need to come in to ensure that the financing of this agenda at the scale that it is needed, that we are more ready and capable of doing.
You spoke of accelerants. I wonder if you can comment on the state of the United Nations itself today. I mean, the world has changed so dramatically since the formation of the UN back in 1945. I mean, many of its structures are still kind of the same. What are some of the reforms you think need to happen in order to bring the UN into the 21st century?
Well, clearly, 75 years later, we are not facing the same challenges, and we are more capable now ever, and more included and inclusive than we've ever been, and connected. So the UN, I believe, continues to be the global town hall for our human family, our global village. And I think what we have to look at is how we can continue to ensure that people can come into this space, that there is a network multilateralism that allows all the stakeholders to come into a member state institution and deliver the expectations to we the people. The reforms in the UN, it's not the first time that we are engaging on reforms. We've had the development reform, which has really put a stronger coordination and platform in the 131 countries that we are in to deliver on the SDGs. But there's also been a lot of efforts made in the other structures, the Security Council, which everyone looks to keep the peace. And here the SG, through the COVID year and 3 months that we've had has had a call for the ceasefire. We have had a call for human rights. We have had the calls for peace in the home. And so our job in the Secretariat and with the Secretary General is to just reinforce and inform the need for the transformations that face another generation. 75 years in, it's not going to be those that form the UN that will be taking the baton forward. It's young people. So that intergenerational transition, where the largest cohort that we have today of youth is existing. So, yeah.
And just real quick, you talked about women being in charge 75 years on. Do you foresee a woman being elected Secretary General of the United Nations anytime in the near future?
Absolutely. I would say that, you know, when we come to the next elections, there should be a woman. There's no reason why there should not be a woman. We are equally capable of bringing the solutions and leading, you know, the support to member states in the United Nations. So absolutely, I will be there making sure that we put our shoulder behind the wheel to getting a woman in place.